discuss a complicated topic that not only has serious ramifications in a person's life, but is a complex issue in applied Torah law. And therefore, I have to say that anyone listening to the content of this video should not consider it as an official psak halacha, an official legal ruling that is personalized for them. If you or anyone else is in a situation where the question of abortion is involved, you must consult a proper rabbinic authority for guidance. This class is for informational purposes only and to help people become more familiar with the issues involved. Now, generally, the discussion of abortion in contemporary society tends to fall in the context of the approach of the Catholic Church versus secular society. There are some very key differences between the Catholic approach to abortion and the Jewish approach to the subject, so let's just mention them briefly. Jewish and Catholic teachings both hold life to be sacred, but they diverge on certain key points. One is the definition of personhood. Jewish law doesn't exactly grant full nephesh status to a fetus until birth, meaning to give the fetus equal status to the mother, while Catholic doctrine considers life to begin at conception, which grants the fetus full moral status. Also, when it comes to exceptions for the life of the mother, Jewish law permits abortion to save the mother's life, while Catholic doctrine typically forbids direct abortion, even in life-threatening cases, relying instead on the principle of double effect for limited scenarios. And finally, when it comes to the moral flexibility of where this is permissible, Jewish law is flexible, particularly for early pregnancy and for severe fetal abnormalities. In other words, we have a Gemara where we see that up until 40 days, a fetus is considered maya bialma. It's considered to have the status of water, which permits abortion in certain cases up to 40 days. After that, it becomes a much more complicated subject. While Catholic doctrine takes a more absolute view and categorizes abortion as intrinsically evil. I mention this just because that tends to be where the discussion falls, as if the abortionists are the secular people and the anti-abortionists are the Christians, but of course we are not Christians, and so we have to understand how this works within Torah law. So we're going to explore the topics of abortion vis-a-vis the supreme value of the preservation of life, which is known in Jewish law as pikuach nefesh. It's not only a contemporary issue. For Noahides, non-Jews who follow the 7 Noahide laws, the question of abortion is especially complex because the halachic sources, Jewish legal sources, often impose stricter standards for Noahides regarding feticide compared to Jews. We'll explain why that is. So let's understand better how Jewish authorities view the principle of pikuach nefesh in the context of Noahide law, with a focus on the permissibility of abortion when the mother's life is endangered. This is a very, very interesting issue because it actually brings us like fully into applied halacha, applied Torah law as it pertains to Noahides. And it's distinct from how it applies to Jews. Now, the Noahide prohibition on feticide, we will find sources 3, 4, and 5 on the source sheets. We'll correspond to what we're about to talk about. The Torah's treatment of feticide for Noahides finds its origin in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. And this verse is central to understanding the moral and legal implications of killing within Noahide law. Very important to understand that abortion is considered to be an act of killing. Killing and murder are sometimes two separate things. So that's an important distinction we have to make. The verse says the following: God tells Noah and his descendants, whoever sheds the blood of man within man, his blood shall be shed. So the verse is clearly speaking about murder, which is one of the prohibitions in the 7 Noahide laws. But the phrase man within man is mysterious, and it needs clarification. In the Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin 57b, we have Rabbi Ishmael's explanation. He understands the phrase man within man as a reference to a fetus, thereby establishing the killing of a fetus as a transgression for Noahides on par with murder. According to this interpretation, feticide, like all transgressions of the Noahide laws, incurs the death penalty. That's why the end of the verse is, his blood shall be shed. But this differs from the law as it pertains to Jews. For Jews, abortion, while it is prohibited, does not typically carry capital punishment. And we have to be very clear here. Jews, like Noahides, are prohibited from unwarranted feticide. But their prohibition is stated in Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 through 23, which corresponds to source number 6 on the source sheets. But the obligation of Jews does not extend to capital punishment for abortion. We will see in the sources later that one explanation for this is that a fetus is not considered a full nefesh, a full person within Jewish law, to the extent that it has equal status to the mother if it presents life-threatening danger. It's not to say that we don't regard the human being in the womb as a full human. We do consider that person a full person. But full person in the halachic sense means that we can't prefer one life over the other. Okay? We'll get into this in more detail. By contrast, Noahides are held to a strict view that killing a fetus is akin to taking a human life, a full human life. Now, we mentioned before that before 40 days, a fetus is considered to be maya bialma, water, just simply water. So if there are problems in Jewish law, even though that maya bi'alma is the potential for a full human life, the application of law is different at that point in time. Without further explanation, we would understand that it would be forbidden to Noahides even to abort at this point, which seems to indicate that the Torah regards the potential for life already stringently as it refers to Noahides. So this sets our stage for a very complex question. The principle of pikuach nefesh, saving life, actually obligates Jews to violate certain commandments to save a life. Does this principle apply to Noahides as well? Now, this corresponds to sources 10, 11, and 12 on the sheets. Again, pikuach nefesh is a principle that mandates the preservation of life, even at the cost of breaking most of the commandments. We see this in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my ordinances, which if a man do, he shall live by them. The simple meaning of this verse is that we experience true living by keeping God's commandments. However, the Talmud in Tractate Yuma 85b famously interprets this verse to mean that one should live by the commandments, but one should not die by the commandments. Meaning, if observing a commandment endangers one's life, he must violate the commandment. An example of this is someone who takes life-saving medicine that must be taken with food. You're all probably aware that Yom Kippur is a 25-hour fast day for Jews. And eating on Yom Kippur is an extremely severe transgression in Jewish law. But in such a case, that person would be obligated to eat in order to take his medicine and preserve his own life. For Jews, virtually all commandments must be set aside to save a life, with three notable exceptions: idolatry, murder, and illicit sexual relations, as we see in source number 13. That refers to a commandment of Kiddush Hashem, when we are forced to either commit one of the three cardinal sins that I just mentioned, or face death. A Jew is obligated to give up his life. This is not a mitzvah that applies to Noahides, and therefore, if they are threatened with death or the transgression of the 7 Noahide laws, they are to transgress and save their own lives. Because again, preservation of life, the sanctity of life, is a supreme Jewish value. The Rambam further codifies this principle in the Mishnah Torah and emphasizes that saving life takes precedence over other mitzvot. And this underscores that one should violate a single Sabbath so that one may live to observe many Sabbaths. We take a long-term view, assuming that the person will be alive to keep commandments if we have to violate them now. Now, of course, I'm giving a Jewish example. That's the observance of Sabbath. So in Jewish law, then, the imperative to save life is not only permitted, but it's an obligation. It's considered a mitzvah in and of itself. And we see this principle applied broadly in halachic contexts and encompassing situations where Jewish doctors are instructed to perform otherwise prohibited activities if it means saving a life. So, for example, treating a patient on Shabbat. Now, the question, of course, is, does pikuach nefesh extend to Noahides? The application of pikuach nefesh to Noahides, especially in the case of abortion, is a significant halachic debate. There are various authorities who weigh in on whether Noahides too are obligated to preserve life even at the expense of other laws, especially given the severity of the Noahide prohibition against feticide. Source 9, Tosfot on Sanhedrin 59a. The Tosfot commentary here introduces two views regarding Noahides and pikuach nefesh in connection with abortion. The first opinion suggests that Noahides are forbidden from performing an abortion even to save the mother's life. This view is based on the strict interpretation that feticide for Noahides is a capital offense akin to murder, which is Rabbi Yishmael's opinion that we saw earlier. And what this implies is that the fetus may be considered a nefesh. The word nefesh means a living being. In this case, fully human, equal status to the mother, whose life cannot be set aside, because we are not allowed to prefer one life over another. So it can't that life cannot be set aside even in situations that threaten the mother's survival. This is different though when it comes to Jewish law. In Sanhedrin 72a, the Gemara is dealing with a situation where a woman is in hard labor, meaning it's life-threatening. If you look at source 8, which is Mishnah Oholot, chapter 7, Mishnah number 6, where the mother's life is endangered, the midwife can kill the infant as long as it has not crowned. Once it has, however, this is forbidden. I mean, once the child enters the air of the world, we can no longer give preference to the mother's life. Now, this distinction, in utero versus already crowned, only applies to Jews according to this opinion in Tosfot. Why the baby has a different status in utero versus crowned is explained by Rashi. That in utero it is not considered to be a nefesh, fully human. Again, not that it's not fully human, not that it's not a human being, but fully human to the extent that it has equal status to the mother. That's in Jewish law. However, for Noahides, the status of the baby is consistent throughout. Full human status. Now, Tosfot began his commentary here with a basic question. We have a principle in the Gemara that there is nothing that is prohibited to Noahides that is permitted to Jews. That's in the Gemara in Sanhedrin 59a, which corresponds to source number 7 in your source sheets. So this is a very peculiar case, because it seems like there is something that Jews are allowed to do that Noahides are not allowed to do. And we have a basic principle that no such thing exists. Why? Because the code of 613 mitzvot must be more stringent than the code of 7 mitzvot. How do we explain this? The second opinion in Tosfot gives us a possible answer. It proposes that Noahides might be permitted to perform an abortion if the mother's life is in danger. That the principle of pikuach nefesh does apply to them in life-threatening cases. Of course, this would align with the broader principle that we find in Jewish law, where the imperative to save life overrides other prohibitions. But what's interesting is that Tosfot implies in this second opinion that, again, that question of how can it be that something is permitted to Jews that's forbidden to Noahides, because the arrow always goes in the other direction. So the suggestion here is that it's not that Noahides are forbidden to apply the principle of pikuach nefesh. It's that they are not obligated to do so. After all, there are 7 Noahide laws. And pikuach nefesh is not one of the 7 Noahide laws. But in cases of definite danger, they may be permitted to voluntarily apply the principle of pikuach nefesh, according to the second opinion in Tosfot. Now, if we zoom ahead to later halachic authorities, the Achronim, and I'm using a lot of name dropping, I'm using a lot of technical terms in this shiur, which you may not be familiar with. We're going to have to review a bunch of these terms so that you can understand how the oral law works and how Jewish law works and what happens at each level of it and how it's broken up into different eras and what the chain of authority is. We'll discuss that in a different shiur. The Minchas Avram is the name of a legal compendium that was written by Rabbi Avram Reinhold, who was a rabbinic authority in Eastern Europe. He offers an interesting middle ground approach. And he argues that pikuach nefesh applies to Noahides, but only in cases of definite life-threatening danger. For Noahides, he contends that uncertain risks, meaning to say it's not certain life-threatening danger, but a risk perhaps, that does not justify setting aside prohibitions such as feticide, such as abortion. This interpretation is grounded in a stricter application of pikuach nefesh for Noahides, meaning to say that it limits the scope that where pikuach nefesh can be applied. But it acknowledges a responsibility to preserve life only where it applies to clear and immediate dangers to avoid unnecessary leniency in the face of the very strict prohibition against feticide. Then we have Rav Moshe Sternbach, Shlita, who should live and be well. He actually lives in my neighborhood. He's a contemporary halachic authority who has served as the Rosh Av Beis Din of the rabbinical court of the Eida Charedis here in Jerusalem. He takes a more stringent stance, probably more in line with the first opinion that we saw in Tosfot. And he maintains that pikuach nefesh does not apply to Noahides in the same way that it does for Jews. According to him, the unique gravity of the Noahide prohibition on feticide, combined with the fact that a fetus may hold full human status for Noahides, means that abortion remains forbidden even when the mother's life is at risk. He emphasizes that the broader principle of preserving life in Jewish law should not be applied automatically in Noahide law, because they are bound by a simpler and stricter code. Right? The 7 Noahide laws do not have the same level of nuance and subtlety that the 613 mitzvot of the Torah do. Then if we look at the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg was a halachic authority in 20th century Jerusalem. He was also the rabbi of the Shaare Tzedek Medical Center. So he was known for his expertise in medical ethics and Jewish law. He created a large encyclopedic work called Tzitz Eliezer, which contains his responsa. He generally maintains a stringent view on feticide for Noahides, but he acknowledges some flexibility in cases of immediate maternal danger. But he introduces a new element. He suggests that in situations where abortion may be necessary to save the mother's life, it could be preferable for a Jewish doctor to perform the procedure rather than a non-Jewish doctor who would be bound under Noahide law to apply a stricter stance with regard to feticide. And this perspective aligns more closely with pikuach nefesh as it applies to Jews, indicating that when life is in imminent danger, there is room for leniency even under the stricter Noahide code. Now, we have to ask the question, what is the legal mechanism that would allow for the killing of the unborn? Since we clearly can see that there are cases where abortion is permitted in Torah law. So what is the legal mechanism that gets us there? Another halachic concept that influences this discussion is what is known as the law of Rodef, or the pursuer. This principle states that one must preemptively take action, even lethal action, to stop someone from killing another person. And the Gemara also says to stop someone from raping another person. It's important to state here that the pursuer doesn't have to have any murderous intent. If a 2-year-old climbs up onto a chair at a nuclear missile launch site and sees that big red button, if we have no other option, we shoot him before he can press it so as to prevent him from killing thousands of people at once. That's the law of Rodef. The Talmud in Sanhedrin 72b, and also we see this in the Mishnah Torah. These are all sources 15 through 19. They describe a fetus that endangers its mother's life as a rodef, as a pursuer who unintentionally pursues her to cause harm. There's no intent here. But this categorization permits abortion if the fetus's presence threatens the mother's life. Now, the notion of the fetus as a rodef provides an additional justification for abortion to save the mother's life, as it allows the fetus's life to be taken as a preventative measure rather than as retribution. Whereas we're not taking revenge on anyone. But the concept of rodef is typically applied in Jewish law, and there's debate on its applicability to Noahides, whose law on murder and self-defense may be less expansive than it is in Jewish law. But at least we have some food for thought here. We can start thinking through this issue using concepts that we find in Jewish law. Now, what about the role of physicians? There's a concept in Torah law called lifnei iver. Lifnei iver lo titein michshol. You shall not place a stumbling block before the blind. That's one of these verses that we'll read in English and just keep going without really understanding what we just read. What does it mean to place a stumbling block before the blind? It means not causing another person to commit a sin. Not doing something, not giving bad advice. Not helping a person to violate Torah principles. And this is relevant when considering whether a Jewish doctor may assist a Noahide with an abortion. Since Noahides face severe restrictions on abortion, what should a Jewish doctor do? Generally, they're advised to avoid involvement in procedures that could lead Noahides to commit sins, except in cases where no other medical option exists to save the mother's life. As we mentioned before, the Tzitz Eliezer and also the Maharit, who is Rabbi Yosef ben Meir Teomim, who was a rabbinic authority in the 16th and 17th centuries, argue that if abortion is unavoidable for life-saving purposes, a Jewish doctor may be the appropriate person to perform it, mitigating the moral and legal burden of the Noahide, who has a much more stringent application with regard to feticide. Now, I heard an idea. I don't want to say it's a cute idea because that sounds like I'm belittling it, but it's a kind of an interesting thought experiment, let's say, if you will. In sources 1 and 2, which are taken from Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 17, we see that Pharaoh specifically wanted Jewish midwives to kill the male children of the Jews. I mean, that's a very cruel thing to do, to subject your slave population to killing its own. But is there any other reason possible why Pharaoh would have preferred to take Jewish midwives? So there's this interesting idea that Pharaoh, as a ben Noach, we forget this. He was a ben Noach. He was Noahide. He was a very lousy Noahide person. But he didn't want his own people to perform these abortions and incur the death penalty for feticide. So he chose Jews, who, although they're also punished for unwanted feticide, they don't incur the death penalty. Of course, in the case of slaughtering viable Jewish babies, they certainly would have incurred the death penalty, and therefore we see that Yocheved and Miriam refuse this, and this is considered an act of tremendous righteousness and self-sacrifice because it was done very much under the pain of death. To summarize, the principle of pikuach nefesh, of saving life, in Noahide law, presents a very complex interplay between strict prohibitions on the one hand and life-preserving exceptions. We've seen key halachic authorities offering various perspectives. Rav Sternbuch, again, maintains that Noahides are held to the strictest standards and do not benefit from pikuach nefesh allowances. Tosfot, the Tzitz Eliezer, the Maharit suggest limited applications of pikuach nefesh, allowing life-saving abortion in critical cases. And we saw the Minchas Avram, who had a very nuanced view that refines this position, permitting abortion for Noahides in cases of immediate certain threat to life. Practically, the leniency of pikuach nefesh for Noahides is generally limited to dire situations, with each case requiring careful halachic consideration, which is why I said at the beginning of the shiur that nobody listening to this or viewing this on YouTube should think that they have heard an official, authoritative halachic decision as to what to do if they happen to be in that situation. They have to find a competent, orthodox rabbinic authority to help them make that decision. For Jewish doctors, the principle of lifnei iver underscores the importance of very cautious involvement. They also would have to consult competent Orthodox rabbinic authorities in cases like these. And this emphasized that even life-saving measures for Noahides must adhere closely to halachic standards. We are not an antinomian religion. We believe in law. The Torah is the law that has been given to all of us by Hashem. So I think what we see is that while the Torah's framework for Noahides is generally more restrictive, the value of life always remains central. And the application of pikuach nefesh demonstrates that Noahides, like Jews, hold a responsibility to protect and preserve life, although their path may require stricter adherence to prohibitions like feticide. And in closing, our exploration reveals how Jewish law views the sanctity of life through the lens of both responsibility and compassion. For Noahides, the prohibition against feticide is rooted in a fundamental value of potential life, derived from the verse, "Whoever sheds the blood of man within man, his blood shall be shed." Yet when a mother's life is endangered, Jewish halachic authorities offer a range of interpretations that balance strict Noahide prohibitions with the moral weight of pikuach nefesh. We saw some opinions restrict abortion for Noahides under almost all circumstances, while others allow it for when life is at immediate risk, guided by the principle of pikuach nefesh. This balance between the value of potential life and the preservation of existing life demonstrates a broader distinction between Jewish and other religious perspectives. We saw the Catholic doctrine takes a stricter, more absolute stance, often without exceptions, whereas Jewish law makes a clear distinction between potential and actual life, prioritizing the life of the mother when threatened. And that's really what's going to be important to those of us who are Torah-observant people. As we reflect on what we've learned, we are reminded of the importance of context and compassion in halacha. Each case is unique. And the depth of Torah law offers guidance tailored to both the sanctity of life and the realities of human existence. This approach not only affirms the dignity of life, but reflects the wisdom of Torah, which offers Noahides and Jews alike a way to honor life with care, respect, and balance. May Hashem guide us exactly to the right answer in all situations.